Hi there. This video is aimed for any GCSE students who are currently studying and in spectacles. You can use this to accompany your current revision of the text, but you can also use it for later stages as well to reflect back on. Now, what I'm hoping to do with today's video is to discuss Mr Birling's character right at the beginning of the play. But I'm going to do this considering an exam question that also came up. We're going to be looking today at this question here. How far do you agree that Mr Birling is a likeable character? Now, I think that we all have an impression right from the start here that Mr Birling is someone that is not supposed to be favoured by the audience, and indeed ourselves as readers, as contemporary readers and analysers of this play. Please note it's really important that we refer to Anne in Spectacles as a play and as having an audience as opposed to us being readers and it being a book. It's really important that you situate this as a play. It's a different type of text. So the first thing that I'd like you to imagine yourself doing with a question like how far or to what extent, you kind of imagine a spectrum. If you consider yourself and consider one labelled, I don't agree that he's very likeable, and one saying, yeah, I do agree that he's likeable. Think about where you sit on that line, just that initial gut instinct. Then it's about locating what moments and what is it about Mr Birling's character that makes us feel that way. Now, when you're coming down to the planning stages of an essay like this, I'd like you to imagine your essay to almost be like a skeleton structure. It's so important that you plan your essays, even if this is quickly within exam conditions, or like you can see in my PowerPoint here, I've had a lot more time to really think about this, and I've just done this with my own Year 10 class recently. So if we think about Mr Birling then at the beginning of Anne in Spectacles, he seems to be tied up with greed. If we think about those initial stage directions and we see that he's presented as being provincial in his speech, as though he has this local dialect. But on top of that, we also see Mr Birling as somebody who opens the play and he is having that initial engagement with the lower working classes, and we see that demanding tone right from the offset. So we have a man here who's very confident, he's very bold of his own sense of awareness, and this is a man that has kind of done well in his life. He has emerged from these kind of more humble beginnings into and kind of become part of the middle classes. He's not an upper class citizen. He hasn't inherited this wealth. He's made his wealth through successful business decisions and through making cuts. And rather than thinking about his employees' well-being, he's thinking about how he can make more money. So that's one aspect of his character that we're not quite keen on, I would say. And then if you think about the positioning of the table, it says there that the furniture is solid and solid furniture, heavy and substantial in that room. So it's got this impression that the Birling family are unwilling to change, unlikely to change, because they're happy with the way that society is working for them. Everything is going in their favour. And again, it shows how reluctant Mr Birling is to help other characters in the play. He's not accommodating of Edna. He's certainly not with Eva Smith. As soon as she asks for more money, he gets rid of her. And it says in those initial pages of the play, still, I don't accept any responsibility for this. And that kind of continues throughout the play for him. He also sees the marriage at the beginning of the play between Sheila and Gerald as an opportunity for business. So it's really key. Every time we talk about that marriage, it's not only a marriage between persons, it's a marriage between businesses, between the Birlings and the Cross Family Limited, and how he sees that as a potential source of income and a way to better his own status and legacy in society. So there's lots there that make us see, get that impression that he's really not very nice. Now, our job is to really think about how we can make that clear, how we can create those clearer points. So if we look at the slide on the screen then, I've said then for your introduction, you need to think about where you are on that line. You know, what is your opinion about the question? Do you think that Mr. Birling is very unlikable? And I am going to argue that yes, he is, for these three reasons. I see him to be a very ignorant character. I see him to be very self-centered, self-absorbed, self-consumed, self-obsessed. And I see him to be very controlling and a dominant character as well. Then as part of that introduction, I need to think about what Precy's intentions are behind that, because essentially this paper is not only allowing you to shed light on your opinion, but you also need to position that with what do you think the writer is doing here? Why is it that Precy sat down one day to write and inspect calls? And I know that Mr. Fitzgerald always refers to this as what is the writer's beef? What's the sort of anger here that's created this impression for writing it? So then if you zoom in to that second box I've got, that would become a paragraph. So my first point, Mr. Birling is an ignorant character. And I think examples of that consist of when he believes that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. We see here that he is talking complete nonsense. He also doesn't believe that labour strikes can happen. And as we know, as a 1945 audience and beyond, there were loads of trade union strikes during this period, lots of resentment against the working conditions and the pay in many industries. And 2 world wars have gone by in the world of a 1945 audience and beyond. Because of that, there's a lot of dramatic irony, and that means what the audience know more than the characters, which again puts us in this position of knowledge and power over Mr. Birling. He just seems to be quite ridiculous. He also refers to himself as a practical man of business who knows. He says, you know, we know. And the irony is that he's got no idea. I think a second point to pick up on is just how self-centered he is. He's, rather than kind of seeing that marriage as a celebration for his daughter, he sees it as that business opportunity, and much of his language is full of economical lexis. So what I mean by that, lots of words associated with business terminology and money. We see long speeches. He rants and rants. He's self-consumed. He loves the performance. We've got the dashes which are peppered throughout his speech, again, emphasizing just how much he loves attention and how he loves that spotlight on him. He has those dramatic pauses used there. We see his desire for money and success over his employee well-being, and how he disagrees about the idea of communism, socialism. The key quotation that you really need to make sure you memorize is the one about community and all that nonsense, as if we were all put together like bees in a hive, as though communism would become a real sting to society. You know, he says, you know, why should we have to look after everybody else? Everyone should kind of stand up and strive themselves. But actually, like, what if people don't have that solid foundations in which to do that in the first place? He seems to be very callous, very cruel, and as he disregards other individuals in society. So I think there's a lot we can say for that one. I think another good point would be that he's very controlling as a character. He's very happy with the way that society is playing out for him. He wants things to stay the way they are, so it'd be a really good opportunity to reference those stage directions there. We see the way that he's very demanding and also condescending towards the Edna is within his household. We see the way that he treats Sheila and Eric as though they are children. He belittles them. He's the one that kind of decides whether they should be in the room, whether they should not be in there. He belittles Eric. He kind of favours Gerald over his son because Gerald has greater prospects than him. And another thing that I've just thought of and I didn't put on there is the way that he tries to control and dominate the conversation with the inspector. But obviously, as we know, the inspector really takes hold of those conversations. as you come to your conclusion, you're essentially building your way up to the end there, and you're saying, ultimately, this is the case, or to conclude, in conclusion, overall, Mr. Birling is presented as this unlikable, unsavoury, and callous character. And the reasons for this are because of X, Y, Z, which could be the cause of this. Ultimately, what is Priestley's larger intentions here? So once you've kind of got that skeleton plan, as you can see there, I haven't written loads, but it's because I know the play really well that I can just kind of select those moments underneath those 3 individual headings. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way that you can do this essay. You could do kind of shorter paragraphs, but I would suggest at least 3 points. For me, the reason I've selected 3 is because it is more realistic of time pressures in an exam. Plus, I favour more denser, detailed paragraphs as opposed to paragraphs that are kind of short and don't really have that depth there. With this question, you need to kind of use this structure for your paragraphing. Now, lower down the school, you may have heard PEE or PEA or peel or petal and all of this, which is fine, but I think there's a much more easier and logistical way through this. Essentially, if you follow this format in both your literature and your language, you can't go far wrong, and it's what AQA as well advise students to do. It just gives you a bit more flexibility with things. So first of all, you're thinking, well, in my paragraph, what is my impression of Mr. Birling? And as you know, for me, I'm saying in one of my paragraphs, he's very ignorant. Then I'm considering, well, how's Mr. Birling being presented as being ignorant? And you select those moments, you unpick those moments, you go under the surface and really extract what's going on there. Analyse the words and their meanings. Analyse the language techniques, analyse the stage directions, because that's all about the how, the way that Priestley's doing this. And finally, both of those lead to the why, because you need to be thinking about, well, why is Mr. Birling being presented in this way? What are the overall intentions that Priestley has? And one way to kind of consider this is actually the what plus how equals the why. And then they kind of all kind of link together quite nicely. So I'm going to demonstrate that to you with this model paragraph. It's one that I've just written, and it's not perfect. Writing is always a form of editing, but this is what I came up with. And I'm going to break down those moments of the what, how, and why as I talk and as I go. So this is my first paragraph about ignorance. To a large extent, Mr. Birling is an unlikable character due to his ignorant persona, and persona is like another word for character, or his personality. On the topic of war, Priestley fashions a protagonist who outlines that some people say war's inevitable, and to that I say fiddlesticks. In a confident expression, Mr. Birling declares how ludicrous the prospect of war really is. And speaking as a hard-headed, practical man of business, he convinces himself that he is right. So let me just sort of unpick this so far then. In that first sentence, I've made it really clear what my impression of Mr. Birling is. I've said, and thinking about where I am in that line, I'm saying, you know, to a large extent, he is unlikable because of his ignorant persona. You can see it's nice, brief, short, concise. I don't want to go into too much more detail than that. And now I'm going to be referring to the quotations and the moments that really give light on this. So these are just some quotations I've got up my sleeve. I know the play really well, and as soon as you have read it, begin gathering those quotations as you go, so you can weave them in as you go. Okay, so I've said that some people say war's inevitable, and to that I say fiddlesticks. So now I'm going into the how. How is that being demonstrated in the play? Well, it's through this quotation, because obviously we know that that is absolutely nonsense. We have the confidence that he also declares alongside this quotation. And I've woven in another quotation here, he believes that he is a hard-headed practical man of business, which in itself, you know, is quite mocking for the audience, because okay, he might be successful in what he does, but he does think he is God's gift to some extent. I know what I'm doing in terms of like showing off my understanding of the language use is I'm zooming in on the word fiddlesticks, because it's kind of like, it doesn't really add to anything, and it's kind of again showing how stupid he thinks people are to actually say, oh no, actually war is a threat and a danger that's coming to us. So I've explained this. The word fiddlesticks further belittles other people's opinions in favour of his own. So this shows that Mr Birling's a man that isn't going to listen to others, he's going to shut down those other opinions. Additionally, which is the nice linking word here, Mr Birling stresses how the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. By repeating the word unsinkable, it pronounces how adamant and assured he is. So I've got here repetition, I'm picking up on that, and I'm now going to pick up on another language technique in this quotation. This combined with the empty epithet absolutely could stress how his character lacks substance, and that his beliefs, like his language, are empty and nonsensical. Now, empty epithet is basically a word which is used, but it kind of doesn't have any meaning. Like the word absolutely, that sentence would make sense without it. Unsinkable, unsinkable. Absolutely, it's just kind of like, it again shows that Mr Birling is just full of nonsense. Even his words lack substance. He doesn't really kind of select words of a higher status, again reinforcing this idea of his ignorance. The ignorant views that Mr Birling professes about trade strikes also adds to the unsavoury impression of his character. As a 1945 audience who would have experienced these three events within their living history, it once again frames Mr Birling as a character who is full of nonsense and unreliable. Really important there that I consider the positioning of a 1945 audience, because that is ticking one of our assessment criteria, which is known as AO3, or context. We need to be thinking about how the history or the biography or the biographical sort of background of the writer also influences our interpretation of the text. So really, really key that we bring context into this and thinking about that role of the audience. Priestley's use of dramatic irony here could emphasise the blinkered view, so this kind of like narrow-mindedness in society stemming from those who considered themselves to be practical men of business, or seen to us as the purple-faced old men. Mr Birling could therefore be a metaphor for the successful middle-class employer who is motivated by their own capitalist greed. Presented in this disagreeable, so kind of unlikable again, way, it is no mistake that Priestley could be shedding light on those in society who are narrow-minded, uninformed, and unlikely to change. So it's quite a dense paragraph, but I've gone into lots of detail. So if I was to kind of sum this up then, I've got that first sentence as my what, all of this down to here, oh sorry, as a 1945 audience would be the how, and then the rest of that is the why. Exactly, you know, what's the point in presenting this man to be ignorant? Well, that's the reason why. It's to make change in society. It's to expose those people that are unlikely to change, and therefore kind of make a showcase of them and really emphasize just how stupid these people are. We're not supposed to like them. Priestley is socialist. He has these left-wing views, which Mr Birling deflects, and therefore he's going to be presented in a more unsavoury light. So feel free to pause this and really kind of reread this again, consider just how I've analysed my quotations, make sure that those quotations are also embedded as part of the speech, and this can, not speech, as part of the writing this paragraph, and have a go of your second and third points as a revision activity yourself. And to challenge yourself further, by all means, write the question and present it to your teachers. So that's it from me, and there'll be a few more of these to come. Thank you.